All right. I'm recording now. So, let's see. Before I... Hold on a second. Let me share the screen. Okay. Before I review the first few parts of Chapter 1 really quickly, in quotations, really quickly, does anyone have any questions to begin?
I think we have a resounding
Wow.
no.
I'm
I think the
skeptical.
crickets are saying no.
I'm skeptical, but alright. Okay, so let's see. This is the first loop-de-loop of David Harvey's diagram, which is largely covered in the first couple sections. So to review, a commodity is something that has use value and exchange value. Exchange value and value being linked that by exchange value being the way you measure value, which is socially necessary labor time. And so labor time is basically the time it took to make the thing, and it's socially necessary because that amount of time is socially determined, meaning it just kind of depends on the material conditions, conditions of production, etc., etc. So the value of a thing does fluctuate through time and space and history and all that. Let's see, what else? In order to exchange a value, it has to be a use value to somebody else, but not necessarily the person that is doing the exchange, right? Because if I'm exchanging something, it's probably because I don't need it and would prefer to exchange it for some other use value. And then we also see that there is sort of this contradiction between use value and exchange value of a commodity, right? So I can only realize the exchange value of my commodity by not realizing its use value, and vice versa. I can only realize the use value of my commodity if I don't exchange it. Pretty straightforward, right? And what else? So, commodity is a value in a system of regular exchange, or I should say, commodity is a value because it's a useful product of human labor. But values become commodities specifically in a system of regular commodity exchange. Because you can have other quote-unquote values, right? I think Marx mentions... Is it Marx? Maybe it's David Harvey. I'm getting mixed up now. But you can theoretically sell stuff like, I don't know, honor or non-tangible things. Or I think one of them mentions like the church selling tithes to get into heaven, right? Like a tithe is technically has a value. It's just not a commodity. It's it's kind of like we were talking about before we started recording. Like in the world of NFTs, it's snake oil salesmanship, pretty much, where you're basically lying about the use value of whatever you're selling to the person who's buying it. And in that case, we're not really interested in that. We're interested in commodities, things that actually do have a real use value that people are actually interested in buying. What else? So, yeah, I think we can come back to this if we need to, but yeah, I kind of fleshed out the diagram a little bit. The other diagram is our hypothetical Minecraft server, right, where there's only four types of objects. So the aggregate total labor time spent collecting commodities in the server or producing commodities is kind of like a big pie chart, and each slice of the pie is a different commodity. So they take up kind of a definite ratio of the total human labor spent collecting them. And these ratios can be expressed through exchange value, right? And now, when you do have generalized exchange, obviously in real life there's lots and lots and lots and lots of commodities, and no one can ever really know for sure how big their slice of the pie is. By there, I mean like if this is my commodity and I want to exchange it, I want to sell it, I'm not totally sure what the value of it is. I don't really know how much the total percentage of the time that all humanities, but like the total of all the human labor power like that went into doing labor, I don't know how much this one commodity is a percentage of that pie. I don't know how big my slice is. Now, there is a way of figuring out what that value is, and it's with this lovely flowchart I tried to make, which I think makes sense. But I'll actually introduce it now at the top, and hopefully it will be actually quite useful as we go through the chapters, especially chapter 2, I think, kind of walks through this, step by step. So let me start here. So if you are someone who has a commodity that you don't need, it is not useful to you, but you would like to exchange it for a commodity that is useful to you, you are probably going to want to determine the most value you can get for that exchange. But, like we just talked about, value is not measurable until you start exchanging things or entering into exchange relations, right? You can't like pick out the value of a commodity and like measure it with an instrument, right? It values a social relation, so you have to do some exchanging. So let's just say our goal at the top is to determine the value of our commodity A. So first step is we want to enter in an exchange relation with another commodity. Okay, so what does the exchange relation look like? So it is in control loop language, or like computer science, I think they would call it a comparator. Meaning, this is where an exchange relation is basically comparing the value of two commodities. And if they are equal, then both parties will consent to the exchange, and Bob's your uncle, basically. Now, if we're selling commodity A, we'll start from a place of ignorance and say we really don't know how much it's worth. Our initial asking price might be higher than its actual value, lower than its actual value. We're not really sure. So we might come in and basically highball. And whoever has commodity B over here is going to recognize that and say, no way is commodity A worth the same as commodity B, and they're not going to exchange them. So we would ask, okay, was the exchange successful? No. Therefore, we can deduce that value A is probably less than value B. So whoever holds commodity B is like, no way, I'm not going to do that. And then you just restart the loop and you keep adjusting your price, and you might overshoot, and then you could say, now if you undershoot, then the other person would be like, oh, that's a great deal, I'm gonna take it. So if it was exchanged, now you should ask, well, can I get more for it? Bump up your asking price and go through the loop again. Now, what is happening here is this little diagram, which is a negative feedback loop. So we're going through a loop, And the feedback is basically, like it says here, reversing the direction in which the system is moving. So our value determination is converging on the real value of A. Now, eventually, when you get to a point where you've picked an asking price that you have converged upon, you've successfully exchanged it, but you can't exchange it for any more, the loop terminates, and that's the value of commodity A, as expressed in a definite quantity of commodity B. And therefore, we can also deduce that the socially necessary labor time for each of these commodities is the same. But this is a little too simple, because the world has way more than just two commodities. And if, for example, so it'd be very difficult to just continually, I guess if the owner of commodity B is very, very patient, they might be willing to go through this process over and over again of you whittling your price down until you have a fair exchange. But the other issue is that whereas commodity B is kind of doing their own loop in some way. And the other problem is that when you start introducing more than two commodities, which there are in real life, if I try to exchange commodity A with B, okay, great, I've got some data. And then, oh no, what if I try and exchange A for like C, and then D, and then E? That data is not super helpful. And it's not, because they're all kind of different tangential loops, if you will. And the only way I could, if I wanted to exchange it with every other commodity, this convergence would take basically forever. It'd be very, very slow and tedious. So what ends up happening in the real world? The real world, commodity B, which is the equivalent form, that's what Marx calls it, suddenly gets replaced with a universal equivalent form. This is what we call money. And this is why money gets developed as a social practice in the first place. Because this process of constantly iterative exchange is incredibly tedious if it's a barter system, basically. And especially when you really scale it up and get to like generalized commodity exchange, bartering and just sort of guesstimating prices is not gonna work. You're gonna get just wild prices all over the place. It's gonna be pretty messy. So what Marx argues is that through this process of iterative exchange, you're going to have to develop some kind of universal equivalent. Now, it could be any commodity, right? Theoretically. And I think, is it section 3, I want to say, is where he basically goes over the general form of value, I think. Where he basically says, this process could be, once it becomes generalized, there's nothing really stopping you from picking any commodity. Like in the chapter, he picks 20 yards of linen as his universal equivalent. But that's not very helpful either, right? Because 20 yards of linen has a use value that's, well, pretty useful. You make stuff out of linen, so maybe not that one. The other things that money needs to succeed at is it needs to be a medium of exchange, so it should be fairly easy to exchange with people, like in a physical sense. Like you should be able to actually carry it around, and it should be fluid. And it also needs to store value, potentially for quite a long time, because even though this is an iterative process, it's not a continuous process, right? You don't go to the market. You're not living in the market every single day, every moment of every day. I guess that does tend to happen nowadays with computers that do actually, they're basically just algorithms that do this shit all the time. But let's say that's not the case. So the reason we eventually come up with gold or silver as a commodity money, so it's basically just a commodity that we chose to be the money form, and it was basically socially agreed upon. There were some good reasons for it. So first of all, gold is inert. For the most part, it doesn't oxidize or corrode. It's not radioactive, so it doesn't decay. And it's fairly malleable. It's not too difficult to make into coinage if you want, and so forth. But eventually, even gold becomes kind of cumbersome, and eventually, even gold will get replaced with some sort of currency, so coinage or paper money, something like that. That basically is just a representation of the amount of gold that's being exchanged. But that's not even the end of the story, because even the gold standard was abandoned eventually. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. Hold on. Give me 1 second. I need to... Old man, I'm muting you for a minute until you get situated. The gold standard got abandoned for a myriad of reasons. First of all, like, not every country has enough gold to make it worthwhile. There's also a finite amount of gold on the planet. And that makes it very difficult for capital to grow, especially at an exponential rate. There's also stuff, I know, at least for the U.S., I'm pretty sure they jumped off the gold standard because of the Soviet Union finding a shit ton of gold, and they were worried that they would mess with them somehow. So anyways, there's a lot of reasons, but even the gold standard got abandoned eventually, and now what we have today is fiat currency, basically, which is controlled by governments. It is subject to policy, which means they can basically just keep printing money if they want to ameliorate problems, but that usually end up just causing worse ones, aka inflation. And that fiat currency is still a representation of value, but it's a little bit different, because it doesn't represent a commodity necessarily, or a single commodity. I know one way of interpreting it is that it kind of represents like a bundle of commodities, or something like this. But yeah, it's a little more wacky wavy, and we will get more into money next time with chapter 3. So, and chapter 2 kind of ends with Marx basically like, this is how we get to money. And that's what I was trying to show with this loop is, this loop and the logic of it hopefully determines or helps us understand like how do we even get to money. The need for something consistent to compare to is sort of that reason. But believe me, there's lots of, even though money does solve this particular problem, it also creates just as many, or probably more. So we'll get into that later, though. So anyways, let's see. What do you think? Should I switch to the PDF? Because I'm going to be mostly reading from my copy. At least just certain little blurbs here and there.
Yeah, hop over to PDF wouldn't be bad.
Yeah, it probably wouldn't be a terrible idea.
Alright, I will do that.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yep.
Yes. Oh, I was just going to interject that, weirdly enough, fiat currency kind of represents what Marx was talking about and bundling, the concept of the commodity into this one single unit.
A quasi-universal trade good.
Yes.
Right.
That's all.
Okay, let's see. 1.4. Yeah, we'll definitely have to dive. I need to actually read myself a little more about fiat currency and stuff like that, because it's a bumpy transition from what Marx is talking about to the modern era. Even though it serves a lot of basically the same functions that he's talking about, there's just there's enough differences, especially the one crucial consequence, which is that numbers on a screen have basically no tangible limit. so yeah, basically I think I posted a David Harvey quote in the chat answering someone's question earlier, but I was like, in that quote, he basically says like it's a double fetish, like you're doubling down on the money fetishization basically, and which probably also doubles down on the confusion, I would assume. Okay, let's see here. Is it showing? Okay, it looks good. Let me also... I need to also switch... okay, cool. I just switch OBS as well. That looks fine.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but sometimes when you have capital on screen, like it will get really blurry. So just might need to keep an eye out for that.
My screen gets blurry?
Yeah, because like I'm watching it right now, and it's just sometimes when like you're scrolling through, it like gets really pixelated.
Oh, well, that's probably more of an issue with the connection than... I know the OBS recording will be fine. It's just like screen capturing.
Okay, fair enough.
All right. So we wanted to start from 1.4 that we left on the back burner, and this is where Marx sort of walks us through his observation of commodity fetishism and what that means, and also why it is unique to the capitalist mode of production compared to other modes of production. And indeed, he says that it appears at first sight a very trivial thing, a commodity that is, and easily understood, but the analysis shows that it's in reality a very queer thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. And he basically starts by saying, right, that like in terms of use value, we're not interested in that. It's more its value that is the more curious part. And
because it can be anything. That's what I take from that, is like the physical thing itself that you use is whatever, but because it's a commodity and it gets exchanged, like it could become anything else.
Yeah, so that's part of it. Also, I can't remember if it's this... Was it earlier in chapter 1 where he says, like, the study of use values is like a thing of... It's like it's a process for history or something. Basically he's saying that, like, ultimately science is like this procedure of discovering use values and multiplying use values and doing all this stuff. And he's like, yeah, that's not what I'm talking about here. We're doing political economy, which means use value. Yeah, sure, it's an important aspect of a commodity, but that's not exactly what's curious about. We can figure out use values, until we're blue in the face, but the exchange value or the expression of value, that is the social, in other words, socially necessary labor time. That's the more interesting part. Let's see. So this is a good. Again, this is where I've got my sticky notes in my book, but the translations are different enough that it's not always easy to find exactly where I am. Okay, so actually, let me turn on the highlighter here. That way y'all can see what I'm trying to read. Okay. Alright, so he says a commodity is therefore a mysterious thing simply because in it the social character of men's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor. Now I think the way David Harvey presents this, I think, is also very helpful, where he basically says that value is immaterial but objective. All right, so let's just unpack that for a second, right? So value is a social relation, so it's immaterial. You can't touch it or feel it, but it's objective because it is observable and it is measurable. But you don't observe it the same way you observe, like I think he uses the analogy, yeah, right here. The same way the light from is perfect, actually, yeah. The same way the light from an object is perceived by us, not as a subjective excitation of our optic nerve, but as the objective form of something outside the eye itself. Right, so I guess I'll read the next part too. But in the act of seeing, there is all events and actual passage of light from one thing to another, from an external object to the eye. And now he's basically, I mean, that's not exactly right, because I guess he does say, okay, yeah, he does say it's different with the commodities. Because with light and seeing stuff, that is material and objective. It's objective because, again, we can observe it, we can measure it, we know it's happening. But it is also material because light is a real thing that actually does interact with physical objects. With commodities, the interaction between them, like the exchange relation, is a social relation. He says there, yeah, so there it is, a definite social relation between men that assumes in their eyes the fantastic form of a relation between things. So the humans who do these exchanges are not totally aware of what is happening, basically, even though they're observing it happen, right? I mean, obviously, if you go to the market and you exchange some money for some groceries, like, it's objective, like, you know that happened. But it's kind of weird, right? If you don't really think about it deeply, like, what about these pieces of paper is enabling me to get this bag of food, right? That there's like, we're several steps removed. Like, how did this even happen? Even if we did, this was a barter situation, I was like, I just built this sick chair, I'll give it to you for some food. Like, that is also kind of bizarre. If you don't analyze it very much. And so, yeah, he basically is saying that in the world of commodities, right, there's a fetishism that arises which attaches itself to the products of labor. So as soon as there produces commodities, and which is therefore inseparable from the production of commodities. Production of commodities, just think of that as capitalism. All right. So, yeah, he basically is pointing out that the social character of labor is where we want to start if we want to figure out what this fetishism is all about. So, let's see. So he starts out by saying all the producers are, like, first stipulation is that the producers that are making all these things are individuals and they're private labor. So this is making a distinction between socialized labor, for example, which you might see in a socialist system, or maybe I think when he talks about the feudal system, he's sort of saying it's more of like a familial relation. So it's sort of socialized, but not. But you still, like, know who's doing the labor, right? Like, oh, it's Johnny's chore to, like, clean the kitchen and take out the trash, right? Like, yes, there's a social division of labor, but you're not totally private individuals who are, like, operating completely independently of one another. If you live in a feudal situation and the the labor in your household and on your land, like the cultivating crops or whatever, you're doing it most likely with a family unit, or maybe like maybe 2 or 3 family units at a time, but you basically know everybody, and it's not there isn't the social division of labor is not so atomized as it is in capitalism. And so that's one stipulation, is that or one thing that leads to fetishism is this atomization of the laboring individuals. Okay. And he also is kind of just walking through kind of a similar argument I think he did before, talking about the division of labor is leading to some of this happening. The division of labor is also why we have human labor in the abstract, because we're equalizing different kinds of labor. When we do exchanges, right, and we're equating the value of commodity A and commodity B, the value being the socially necessary labor embodied in it, specifically that labor being abstracted, right? So, because again, all that we care about is that human labor is expended for a definite period of time to produce this thing. The actual character, physicality of that labor doesn't matter. And the only reason that would be relevant is if we had a social division of labor, meaning everyone has their own different job, basically, and that in order to exchange the product of one job with the product of another job, we socially perform this abstraction of equalizing them into abstract labor. All right, let's see. Okay, so what would I want to read here? I think, wait, what is at the end of this one? Oh, this is where I'm trying to find where I am in the document here. No, I think I already passed that. Okay. Okay. Oh, yeah, I'll just highlight this really fast because I skipped over it. Like I was talking about in the PowerPoint slides, right? The sum total of labor of all these private individuals forms the aggregate labor of society. Aggregate labor of society, think of that as the big pie. That's the big pie that we all contribute to if you add all of our collective efforts together. And, okay, so let's see. Stupid thing keeps jumping around on me. Okay, here's a good, let's jump here. So this is also kind of partially where I started the thinking about that feedback loop diagram. So the beginning of this paragraph, he says, what, first of all, practically concerns producers when they make an exchange is the question, how much of some other product can I get for my own? In what proportions the products are exchangeable? That's ultimately an important question if you are going to engage in exchange, right? You want to know, how much can I get for this thing? And he says, but when these proportions have, by custom, attained a certain stability, and remember, stability, think of the negative feedback loop converging on a value that is reached a stable point. They appear to result from the nature of the products, so that, for instance, 1 ton of iron and 2 ounces of gold appears naturally to be of equal value as a pound of gold and a pound of iron, in spite of their different physical and chemical qualities, appear to be of equal weight. So he's basically, I think, trying to say, if you didn't witness this feedback loop happening, if you didn't actually observe any of that yourself, and you enter the market where, you know what, gold and iron have like a pretty steady exchange rate, right? No, it doesn't fluctuate very much. We're pretty confident of, the ratios in which they exchange. You could just be like, yeah, that's just how it is, right? Gold's just worth more than iron. What is there to say? And that should be our first clue that, like, again, I think I mentioned this or David Harvey mentions this in the first chapter, right, where he says, anytime you see the word appear, that is basically Marx telling us that's not how it actually is. That's like our first clue that if something appears a certain way, it's almost certainly not actually that way, or maybe even the opposite. So indeed, yeah, if you see this exchange ratio, you're like, wow, that's great. That just must be how everything works. Like, you're getting duped by appearances. Okay, so, and then, yeah, again, this is also, I'm just walking through my train of thought, making that dang feedback loop. So he says, the character of having value, when once impressed upon products, obtains fixity only by reason of their acting and reacting upon each other as quantities of value. It's acting and reacting. That is, and again, upon each other as quantities of value. So these products with value are only reaching fixity. They're only reaching this stable convergence through a lot of exchange, acting and reacting upon each other. Right? So he's telling us this is an iterative process. And it's an iterative process that happens between pretty much all commodities out there. Yes, I am recording this. Okay, so let's see. And then he also mentions at the end here that these quantities vary continually, independently of the will, foresight, and the action of the producers. So, again, visualize the feedback loop diagram where we're converging on a certain value or a certain, numerical quantity. That also can fluctuate, right? Because, anything that can affect the value of something. So, in other words, the socially necessary labor time, right? What can affect that? Well, technology is probably one of the biggest ones. Like how much human labor did this actually take to produce? If I come up with a contraption that can, allow me to produce an individual commodity much more rapidly, its value is going to drop, right? And so that's what he means by these quantities are also, yes, they're converging upon a stable value, but then something might happen, some technological development, maybe it's like a resource shortage, ecological collapse. Who said that? Lots of external factors can make the value of something fluctuate. But once it does fluctuate, the feedback loop keeps it going and will return to a stable point. So yeah, that's another point that I didn't mention before, but it's just as important. Okay, so let's see. He says, to them, their own social action, takes the form of the action of objects, which rule the producers instead of being ruled by them. And it requires a fully developed production of commodities before, from accumulated experience alone, the scientific conviction springs up that all the different kinds of private labor, which are carried on independently of each other, and yet as spontaneously developed branches of the social division of labor are continuing to be reduced to the quantitative proportions in which society requires them. And why? Because in the midst of all the accidental and ever fluctuating exchange relations between the products, the labor time that is socially necessary for their production forcibly asserts itself like an overriding law of nature. So, let me highlight that last part, right? Okay, so this first part is pretty good, right? Where he says, basically, the relations between these objects kind of rules the producers instead of the producers ruling their products. And this is a recurring theme I think that we're going to see. Like, for example, I know the old man's favorite essay of the capital is a real god. We'll kind of get to that, but right, Marx will kind of come back to this point a couple different times where this process of generalized commodity exchange will often have this side effect, or maybe just primary effect, of dominating the humans involved in the process instead of the humans controlling the process. Yes, the humans are the driving force of it, but they are not really the impetus. So that's kind of interesting, right? And then as we get to the end here, right, he's basically saying, in the midst of the accidental and ever fluctuating exchange relations between the products. Okay, so first part right there. So he's saying accidental in this case just kind of means random. So maybe this means maybe I've accidentally overpriced my product, right? And this happens probably all the time when a new producer brings their thingamajig to the market and their initial asking price is way too high. But they're going to get feedback. They're going to get negative feedback. And that process, and they might underprice it and figure out that they might be able to make more, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of fluctuation going on. And tons of exchanges that each individual is not bearing witness to personally. Nobody is really bearing witness to every exchange personally. But what is happening is that the value, or basically the exchange relations are converging upon the actual values of the products, which is the labor time that is socially necessary for their production. And he compares it to the law of gravity, right? The gravity is pulling you back down to some stable, I don't know, energy state, if you want to think of it that way for gravity. But for the exchange value of a commodity, it's always trying, basically, because humans that are exchanging their stuff, because they have the drive to get the most out of their exchange, and the person you're exchanging with also wants to get the most out of their exchange, and this is a social interaction, that through this iterative process we are going to determine that value is the socially necessary labor time that it took to produce the thing. And that's what he calls the secret that's hidden under the apparent fluctuations in the relative values of commodities. Determination. There we go. The determination of the magnitude of value by labor time is therefore a secret. So he's telling us that Marx has pulled back the veil that has stupefied so many before him, because people saw the fluctuations, and didn't know how to make sense of them. They'd come up with all kinds of explanations for what this might be. Because, I mean, don't get me wrong, like, people kept good data of exchange rates, even like way back when. Because again, everyone is, a little self-interested here. They want to get the best bang for their buck, so to speak. So keeping good data was important. But what he's trying to tell us is that, the way people have interpreted that data thus far is incorrect, or in a lot of cases they're not even bothering with data. They're just fucking making it up. But he's basically telling us that, this is the secret. This is actually the machine behind all the fluctuations, and there is a logic to it. So yeah.
So
Go ahead.
to tie this into maybe like terminology that people have maybe already heard, it almost feels like he's alluding here to the invisible hand of the market, but kind of doing so in a bit of a sideways way. And kind of discussing like, so here's that mysterious invisible hand that they've been talking about, because I believe that was Adam Smith, if memory serves, and that's fairly contemporary to Marx, give or take. So that, I mean, it feels like he's really kind of taking a sort of sideways dig at that and trying to unpack that without so much saying so. Which actually almost seems uncharacteristic of Marx, because he has a tendency to call people out.
True.
But like this whole little just like last couple of paragraphs, there's a lot in there, and I feel like we'd also be remiss to overlook footnote 30, where he quotes Engels in relation to the comment about gravity. What are we to think of a law that can only assert itself through periodic crises?
It is just a natural law which depends on the lack of awareness of the people who undergo it. Yeah.
That kind of makes some sense to me in the thought that, like, if you were to have people, like, start trading commodities to figure out value, again, without any reference points forever, and you, like, want to trade an apple pie for a diamond, but you got a family member who mines diamonds, so you know how long and how hard it is to get a diamond. Like, if you have a good apple year, the diamond person's going to be like, well, I know you had a good apple year, so it was super easy for you to make this many pies, so I want more pies. But if there was a shitty apple year, like, I don't know if I'm explaining it right, but it makes sense to me that people would independently, like, gauge the value of something based off of how hard it is to produce, like how much time and effort.
Right.
Like if we were to
let's just say that you and I meet in the market. You have your apple, I have this book, Capital Volume 1. And I'm sick of Capital. I want to get rid of it. I don't want to read it anymore. And you are like, I don't really want this apple. I want a nice book to read. Now, you know how much, let's just say that you picked the apple, right? You roughly know, this may not be the greatest example because Capital took way longer than it took to pick a fucking apple. But anyways, we don't even need to make the exchange, but let's just say we meet. Now you know how long it took you to get that apple. Maybe it was like 10 minutes. I don't know, walking into your yard, getting a ladder, picking the apple, and then putting the ladder back. It was a pretty easy process, whatever. And I know roughly how much I paid for this book and how much I'd like to get for it. Now, when we meet in the market, I'm not really aware of the labor time that you spent to get that apple, and you're not really aware of the labor time that I spent to get this book. And yet we both, so that's what Marx is saying when he says that neither of us knows the exchange value of the others, neither of us knows the value of the other's commodity, but you have a kind of an idea, or at least an accidental, what he keeps calling accidental, you have a rough guess of the value of what you have. But you're also concerned about the use value of my book, and I'm concerned about the use value of your apple. And that's sort of one of the contradictions that happens in exchange, is that we're both looking for use values, but we're trying to get as much value as we can. That's one of the weird parts of it. Anyway, but the other thing I was going to add also, on top of what you said, though, and also kind of piggybacking off of Anatolia's point, is hopefully this is a fairly common quote that most people have heard, right? But the idea that sort of anything, I know it's related, the quote is originally about technology, right? But any technology that's sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic, right?
Mm-hmm.
What Marx is doing, now he is performing a scientific analysis of capitalism. And now he's not exactly analyzing like something like technology. He's analyzing the social system. But we could also say that like any sufficiently mystifying social system is indistinguishable from basically religious myth, right? Or you come up with any old mythical explanation you want, it seems just as reasonable as the other, because they didn't have, before Marx is writing this, there wasn't really a scientific analysis of this mode of production. So he's kind of arguing that we had primitive analysis of this stuff that really kind of led people astray. And yeah, they had ended up landing on things like the invisible hand of the market, which, come on, I mean, that's not much different from like the big invisible guy in the sky who makes stuff happen. It's like not that much different of an explanation, really.
Yeah, and basically here he's saying like that's a cop out and it can absolutely be explained.
Yeah, exactly. He's saying he's like, this stuff is objective, guys. Like all we got to do is observe what's happening. We don't need to just hand wave, pun intended.
Well, and like in a barter situation, like if you were starting civilization again, the value that people would assign to the thing that they produced would be based off like how hard it was, like that's like, I feel like it would independently kind of, if we restarted society, the relative values of things would end up being similar because of how hard it is to produce the things, assuming, not thinking about like geographic distribution of resources or whatever, but just like it is this hard to make this thing. So people would naturally feel like, I don't really want to trade it for like less than I think it's worth because it was hard for me to make. And that's like a universal thing, like that would just come over again and again. No matter how many times we restart society, something that's harder to make is going to be worth more to you than something that's super easy to make. So the whole like negative feedback loop of figuring out the actual value of things or the stable value of things will pretty much always like play out the same way, is based on the labor put into it. It's kind of, that's the takeaway that I'm getting.
Right. You're pretty much correct there, as far as, when you're talking about a barter society in which, people, I guess, aren't removed from that labor process and kind of are going to have a little bit of, I'm going to say, empathetic insight into like what the other person does or goes through to kind of come to a middle ground in a barter situation. But actually, David Harvey made, and I think I actually wrote down his quote verbatim from his lecture. We're talking about when you have these exchange relations under capitalism. He says people under capitalism do not relate to each other directly as human beings. They relate to each other through the products they encounter in the market, which is essentially to say that you don't necessarily. I think he goes into a whole analogy about like where did your breakfast come from, and that you don't necessarily know the entire backstory of like every single thing, that you can't really know like every little bit of labor that went into it because the process has become so complex. So in a system where it's like, you know, I made this pie and I made all of the things that went into this pie, and therefore I know exactly how much labor went into this pie, and then you would know the full value of it. But if you're like, I made this pie, but I bought the flour and the apples and the sugar and the butter at the store, you know how much labor you put into it, but you don't know how much labor went into, you know, producing and transporting all of the ingredients that you went and bought. You don't, you know, you kind of can't, you know, find that perfect number, and there's no way of knowing that. And so you don't relate to, you know, it's like you relate to the product then, but you don't relate to all of the people whose labor went into the product.
That makes sense.
Yep. And so that actually leads nicely into this next section where he quickly comments on the money form, right? Because the money form kind of smooths out all these exchanges, right? Because now we don't need to scratch our heads and really think, man, is an apple worth an entire book? Because, like, that is almost an absurd statement in some sense. It's like, how do you even begin to determine that? Instead, basically, what Marx says is, well, we came up with money, or he says, or I should say, consequently, it is analysis of the prices of commodities that alone led to the determination of the magnitude of value, and it was the common expression of all commodities and money that alone led to the establishment of their characters as values. And it is, however, just this ultimate money form of the world of commodities that actually conceals, instead of disclosing, the social character of private labor and the social relations between the individual producers. So it's ironic, right? Because money kind of arose as the social practice of having this universal equivalent with which to exchange things with, right? So instead of me trying to negotiate an apple for a book, which would be very challenging, instead, you know, you can just sell your book for some money and use that money to go buy apples, or, you know, flip it around. You could sell the apple for some money and go buy a book, or maybe you don't have enough money, so you need to sell some more things, and then you'll finally have enough money for a book. So ultimately, money forms as this very initially it's very convenient. It makes exchange much smoother, and once we get to this process of generalized commodity exchange, it's just downright necessary, because money's been around much longer than the kind of especially the capitalist commodity form. Money's been around quite a long time, and it's been used for all kinds of exchanges. So just in the basic exchange relation, which isn't really unique to capitalism, right? You'd still have money as some universal equivalent. You know, basically, even this has been well known and well practiced for long time. But what Marx is saying here is that despite it being useful for this process of exchange, it actually makes things more mysterious, right? He says it is actually concealing the social character of private labor, and the social relation between the individual producers, right? Because you and I aren't really. This is actually just like Anatolia said, right, from David Hardy's video. We're not actually meeting face to face as human beings and like talking this out, like you might in some kind of barter system. We're not actually doing that, right? we're just interfacing with money. And when we interface with money, or someone handing us money, money is concealing the fact that you and I are exchanging as two human beings. Indeed, I'm actually just exchanging with some pile of money, and then you exchange with that same pile of money again. We never actually really interact. We're both of us are just interacting with this money form that is not really a person, but it at least represents, like he says here, right? Or actually, he says, he brings up a kind of a funny, I think it's kind of a funny comparison, right? Where he says, if I said that, he says, when I state that coats or boots stand in relation to linen, because linen is the universal incarnation of abstract human labor, the absurdity of the statement is self-evident. Right? So if you went to the market and be like, I have this piece of linen, it is the universal incarnation of human labor, you'd be like, wow, cool, dude. But you're kind of dumb. But if he says, nevertheless, when they compare their articles with linen, or he says what is really the same thing, gold or silver, they express the relation between their own private labor and the collective labor citing the same absurd form. And so yeah, he's saying, if you compare boots with linen, it sounds absurd. But if you do it with gold or silver, aka the money form, it sounds great. You're like, yeah, of course, we do that all the time. Which also is kind of a hint at this fetishism, right? Because
your interactions are just...
Yeah, it's still goofy. You just think it makes sense because you've convinced yourself it makes sense.
It's just, your interactions are just 3 stacks of cash and a trench coat.
A little bit.
And it's like not even the money that you're exchanging for. It's like all the things that you would buy with the money, because you're not even like thinking about like what you would do with money as money, because you don't fucking do anything with money as money, but it represents all of the different things. So it could represent anything.
All right, so the next couple bits here are Mark's kind of walking through a couple different scenarios to illustrate to us why this generalized mode of commodity exchange under capitalism is the one that produces fetishism and not some of the other ones. So he begins with Robinson Crusoe, which for anyone who hasn't read the book, he's a British dude who gets stranded on an island, conveniently finds a dude who will work for him for free. It's very sus and bizarre, but point being, let's just say hypothetical dude on a stranded island, like he's stranded on an island. Let's not even talk about the weird bizarre justification for colonization that the book tries to preach. But in this scenario, Marx says in the book, he's a very diligent Briton, and he keeps a record book of how long he spends doing certain activities. So this might be like building his shelter, getting his fire started, cooking fish, gathering water or gathering wood, etc. Right? He has a whole laundry list of things to do in order to survive because he's stranded and there's no one else there. Let's just pretend like there's no one else there to help him. In this, basically what he's trying to get at is that in this scenario, Crusoe is not going to fetishize like any of his belongings. Why? Because he's the one who made them. He knows exactly how long he spent making it. He did it with his own hands. It's also like a rare situation where we would say that he's not really alienated from his labor. Like his labor's right there in front of him, in definite amounts. So, there's no alienation there. There's no one to exchange with. So this is sort of like it's a book, it's a fiction, obviously, so it's a hypothetical scenario where there isn't there's no exchange at all, and you just have a single producer making all the articles that they could possibly need. So, and then he gets into, he says, okay. Also, he throws a dig at this guy, Sedley Taylor, I don't know, some other economist probably. He shits on him out of nowhere, basically saying this is so obvious and intelligible that even this motherfucker could understand. And he's also pointing out that Robinson Crusoe basically derived what value is on his own, even though this dude couldn't, which is pretty funny. So he says, okay, now we can move from Crusoe's Island to the Middle Ages, where you do have let's see, I'm trying to find exactly what he calls it. Yeah, he says we find everyone dependent. So they're not independent like Crusoe was. He's just totally by himself. In Middle Ages, aka like basically some sort of feudal system. We do have some dependency on other people to do labor for you, right? So like, oh, Jesus Christ, what the fuck was that?
That was man's
Okay.
whatever having a bit of a seizure.
Okay.
Sounds like someone just gassed their mic.
I don't know what that was, but I muted you for now.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, yeah, they're basically the serf feudal society has got some dependence. There's some division of labor, and he also says that the particular natural form of labor, and not as in a society based on production of commodities, its general form is the immediate social form of labor. So you immediately are like seeing the results of your labor, basically, because if you are a serf and you're like harvesting wheat or sheep or shearing sheep or something, you immediately basically appropriate all the products of your labor, but then a lord will come by and be like, okay, 25% of that is mine, okay, bye. But then like the serf, or maybe I don't know what the fucking serf lord relationships are like, maybe it's more like 80% would go to the lord, whatever. But basically,
I was going to say 25 seems pretty low.
It's a pretty generous lord, I guess, yeah. But yeah, no, you basically, you're still working together with other people, and those people are probably family members or very close relations. So you're not like totally atomized, and you do get to reap the benefit of some portion of the products of your labor. But there's not, so yes, there is some exchange of basically goods and services, but it's not very systematized yet. Okay, so let's see. I wanted to get to the one. Here we go. Yeah. So let's get to this paragraph because I think it's one of the only. Like, there aren't that many. Like, basically, surprisingly, Marx does not actually talk about socialism that much and communism that much, right? But he actually does use it as another of these hypothetical case studies. Hold on. Okay, so he says, let us now picture to ourselves, by way of change, a community of free individuals, carrying on their work with the means of production in common, in which the labor power of all the different individuals is concise. Is that concisely? If it is not spelled right. Consciously. Sorry. I don't know why I was reading that wrongly. Is consciously applied as the combined labor power of the community. So he's saying, let's take another case study here, which all of us probably should be able to recognize as socialist or communist, whatever. I think this one's... He gives some example, I think... I think he says, the share of each individual producer and the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time. I think that's pretty close to from each according to their ability to each according to their need. This is the socialist one, right? Where he says it's like from each according to their ability to each according to their contribution or something like that.
That is correct.
Yeah.
The initial one, yeah.
So anyways, yeah. So he's saying, okay, now we're basically he hasn't gotten to this language of class yet, but essentially, what if there weren't classes? And the labor power of all is consciously applied as the combined labor power of the community. Consciously kind of implies planning, right? There's a conscious... so there isn't a totally random social distribution, social division of labor. It's a little more organized than that, and we can also... he basically compares it here that it's kind of like the Robinson Crusoe example, except that they are social instead of individual, the characteristics. So everything produced by him was exclusively the result of his own personal labor and therefore simply an object of use for himself. But the total product of our community we could just call a social product, and one portion serves as a fresh means of production and remains social. He's basically saying of that total portion, of the total products, one portion goes towards new means of production, and when he says remains social, he means is not private property, right? But then the other portion goes towards means of subsistence. So, food, shelter, clothing, blah, blah, blah. Distribution of this portion amongst them is, he says it'll vary, right? This is where he does throw out this line as like, this is potentially how they would do it. But he actually does say, the mode of distribution will vary with the productive organization of the community and the degree of historical development, right? So, and he does postulate, okay, maybe it would look like, he says, we'll assume. Again, that means it's basically just a hypothesis. He doesn't know for sure if this is how it will be done. But yeah, because in this situation, the socialist scenario, the product of the total labor is socially owned, if you want to use that language, I guess. I don't know if ownership would have much meaning anymore, but because there's a social product and we consciously, as a group, decide what to do with it and how it gets distributed, then there's not going to be any fetishization. How do you say that? Fetishization?
Fetishization.
Yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue. Exactly. Okay.
It's not a kind word.
No, but yes, he's saying that should be relatively gone. Just like in Robinson Crusoe's case, because Robinson Crusoe does not fetishize the product of his labor because he knows I'm the one who made it. Duh. And similarly, in the socialist case, it's more like saying, we're the ones who made it. Duh. Because we planned it. We organized this as a group. Hopefully, some kind of democratic planning that meets our community's needs. I think that's what he means by means of subsistence. So he's saying like a portion of our productive, of our total product will go towards meeting our immediate needs, which is the means of subsistence. So this is building houses for people, clothing, food, water, blah, blah, blah. And then some other fraction of that will be improving and building up the productive forces. So that means production. So this could be, scientific research and development, building new, better machines to build stuff with. Hopefully this is sort of the positive mode of the positive mode of automation, right? Where automation is replacing human labor that we don't want to do, and so on and so forth. So basically he's doing another case study: socialism good because fetishization much less common. All right, so let's see. Fun refrain: the religious world is but a reflex of the real world. Good old-fashioned dialectical materialism going on, right? What else? Let's keep going. Check my little notes here. Oh yeah, I wanted to, let's see. Okay, yeah, this is sort of the wrapping up. Actually, I'll do the last sentence of this one as well. Okay, so he says, the religious reflex of the real world can, in any case, only then finally vanish when the practical relations of everyday life offer to man none but perfectly intelligible and reasonable relations with regard to his fellow men and to nature. Personally, I like highlighting these mentions of nature that Marx often will throw in capital, because again, I like the fact that he has a very ecological perspective on things, right? So, he's basically saying that he basically is saying, I don't think we'd have much need for religion, or at least if not literally religion, then at least religious connotation, especially related to the economy, right? This is like the invisible hand of the market. He's like, we don't need that. We especially don't need it if everyone understands the organization of the economy and also participates in the organization of the economy, and he understands his relations to his fellow human beings and to nature. I think underrated, right? How much Marx is actually going to keep hammering home that like capital doesn't give a fuck about nature. Basically, it is like
he was remarkably ahead of his time in that way.
Oh yeah, way ahead of his time. I mean, I think the so-called like eco-socialist movement is like a very recent phenomenon, but it's like Marx was ecologically minded from Jump Street. So yeah, that's why I personally don't really think the eco-socialism is like a meaningful designation. I think socialism is by definition a more ecologically minded organization of the economy, personally.
Well, I mean, anything that doesn't proselytize infinite growth on a finite planet would be more reasonable.
Yeah, that's a good starting point. The good one starting point is to at least acknowledge the laws of nature. You would think that's like the bare minimum, but no. And then, okay, let's get a short paragraph right here. The life process of society, And I think I'm trying to find this sentence. Anatolia, let me know if you find this short paragraph in the book. I'm still looking for it.
Which one were you looking for?
It starts with the life process of society. I'm trying to find if in the other translation if he calls it social metabolism, because I think that's the same. I think that's what he's talking about.
I was gonna say just behind that quote that you were talking about, religious reflections, there is a point where he talks about the veil is not removed from the countenance of the social life process, i.e., the process of material production, until it becomes production by freely associated men. Is that what you're looking for? Or
I think so. What page is that on?
173. It's basically like right up underneath where you talking about the religious reflections of the real world.
Yeah, he also, I think this translation also throws in species connection, which is sort of a little throwback to old, or I should say young Marx. Yes.
I also do kind of, in this whole little paragraph here, I do find it rather masterful how he critiques religion while also acknowledging essentially the material conditions by which it exists and continues to exist, and in thus doesn't necessarily criticize religious people so much as the institutions.
Yep, and then, okay, I found the other part I wanted to mention, because I don't think this is in the PDF, unless I'm just blind to it. But on that same note, basically he's right, where he's saying the real limitations, these real limitations that he's talking about, meaning like a religious outlook on the economy, are reflected in the ancient worship of nature and in other elements of tribal religions. The religious reflections of the real world can, in any case, vanish only when the practical relations of everyday life between man and nature, generally present themselves to him in a transparent, rational form. So it might be in here somewhere, just in different language, but again, and maybe the old man or his ears will perk up here. But basically, I think what Marx is saying is that older religions, quote unquote pagan religions that are very animist, think about how ancient people sort of came up with these religions, right? They're animist in the sense that they sort of believe that the forces of nature are personified in a god or some sort of entity. So, right, think of like the storms. You know, there's huge storms, thunder and lightning. There must be a thunder god, or a lightning god, or a storm god. You know, the wind is howling outside and it's super cold. There must be a wind god. There must be, you know, there's a big harvest this year. Must be a harvest god. Must be some, you know, we had a ton of babies. Must be a fertility god. Basically, he's pointing out like the parallel that when people don't understand in a very scientific way what's happening around them, we sort of just attribute like sort of deistic or animist properties to them, right? We try and explain them in very rudimentary and oftentimes quasi-religious ways. And he's basically saying this is no different under capitalism. It's the same thing, because whether it be the old school bourgeois economists or just the average person involved in the economy, they're not really aware of the inner workings. They haven't done they don't understand the science behind it. It hasn't really been uncovered. So of course you're going to throw out very wishy-washy explanations that don't really make much sense. They're, you know, because ultimately what Marx is trying to say is like something like saying, oh, it's just the invisible hand of the market, is just as goofy, or should be just as goofy to us as someone in the ancient, you know, in ancient society being like, oh, well, Zeus caused that thunderstorm, right? he's basically saying it's kind of the same thing. It's coming from the same place of ignorance and mystification. So anyways, yeah, I thought that was an interesting point. And when we do our first non-capital reading in 2 weeks, we will be reading that essay, Capital is a Real God, which hopefully will kind of give everyone a new perspective on a lot of, basically a lot of what's going on in the first 3 chapters. And hopefully should be pretty fun to read, because he really, the writer who wrote that essay really dives into Marx's metaphors and analogies and so forth, and it's pretty fun. Okay, I think that's. Oh, go ahead.
No, just gonna say yes. Contrary to what I got yelled at about when I mentioned it last time, it's very much like you said. It's about explaining the root meanings of those metaphors, and also then kind of flipping it around and saying, but here's how it kind of is. Like, yeah, it's a cool essay. It'll be fun. All right, that's it.
Okay, I think that's mostly all I got for 1.4. And then chapter 2, like I said, the diagram I made, the flow chart, is very much based on chapter 2. The process of exchange. Let's see here. Sorry, I gotta keep up with the PDF. I know it probably looks like I'm skipping a lot here, but it's a lot of footnotes.
Yeah, there's almost like 2 full pages of footnotes.
Yes, there are.
Although, just kind of on your own time, he does a pretty scathing critique of classical political economy in footnote 34 in chapter 1. So, if anybody has been reading and skipping the footnotes, I do recommend going back and reading that one. Also,
Yep.
that's another example of why I would love to resurrect Marx and show him Twitter.
Yep.
He'd
Okay,
write a great diss track.
Let's see. Oh, I'm just trying to figure out where to start. Okay, I mean the first thing he throws out as one of the preconditions for exchange in chapter 2 is oh gosh, it's in here somewhere. Yeah, here we go. They must therefore recognize or mutually recognize in each other the rights of private proprietors. It is a juridical relation which thus expresses itself in a contract. Whether such contract be part of a developed legal system or not is a relation between 2 wills and is but the reflex of the real economic relation between the 2. So
Did he say a juridical relationship?
Juridical.
Okay, never mind.
Yeah. Druidical is druid stuff. Juridical is judicial stuff.
Yeah.
Or, in other words, like a legal system. So anyways, this is basically just him saying one of the preconditions for generalized commodity exchange is private property. Right? You need to have both parties acknowledge that they can't just steal the other person's shit. That, they have some legal protection. Now, I mean, he says that it may or may not be like a actual legal system. It might be more of a, well, I guess in this translation he keeps calling it a reflex of the real economic relations. So right? Reflex is sort of like saying reflection. The private property is acknowledging that we're two different people. We got our own property, which is these commodities that we want to exchange.
The Penguin translation says it's a relation between two wills which mirrors the economic relation. So I think Engels translation uses like reflexive, where I think the Penguin translation usually uses like mirroring.
Yep. Actually makes me think if like, is it reflex like a muscle reflex, or is it reflex like a mirror reflects light? I don't know.
There's sort of like an in-between direction of where something is reflexive to where it's almost like referential back and forth, essentially.
Yeah.
One references the other.
It's dialectical.
It is.
Yes, that.
Personally, I think I like the use of mirror a little better. Anyways, yeah, mirror is a good one too, because in a mirror, you kind of, I think we all kind of understand that like the reflection in the mirror is, while it looks like the same, like the real thing, it is not in itself the real thing.
Oh, and there we go with the appearance thing again.
Exactly. Yeah. Anyways, so yeah, he's getting us started on private property. Okay. Let's see. I guess we can walk through this paragraph really quickly. He says, what chiefly distinguishes a commodity from its owner is the fact that it looks upon every other commodity as but the form of appearance of its own value. So again, this is the boy. Again, it's a very subtle difference in the translation, but it's easier to understand the other version. But the other version says, what chiefly distinguishes a commodity from its owner is the fact that every other commodity counts for it only as the form of appearance of its own value. Anyways, but again, this is sort of, to me, it's talking about like the exchange as this comparison mechanism, right? So every other commodity that it is brought into exchange with is the physical manifestation of its own value. In other words, I can't figure out my own value until I'm brought into relation with some other commodity.
That's like the weight thing. The weight analogy helped me so much with that. The like pound of sugar to lumps of iron.
Exactly. Yeah, that is a good analogy for it. Yeah, and really, I mean, the feedback loop analogy, it can also be as simple as thinking about like a thermostat, right? Where I mean, it's a little different because you typically set the temperature. But if you set the temperature of your thermostat, it'll just begin a loop of measuring the temp. First step is to measure the temperature with the thermometer, and then, so that's the exchange relation. Then you do a comparison, compare the measurement to the variable, which is basically the temperature you want it to be. And then it'll go into a decision matrix where it will say, was it too cold, too hot, or just right? If it's just right, the loop terminates and the thermostat doesn't need to do anything. If it's too cold, it'll turn the heat up. If it's too hot, it'll turn the heat down. And then keep looping and keep checking periodically. Pretty much the same process is happening here, except it's through for value instead of temperature. So anyways, yeah, I hope I'm not totally losing anyone with that the feedback loop analogy, but it does help me keep track of what the heck is going on. Okay. Let's see. This is another point I think I brought up earlier with the diagrams where a commodity is a non-use value for their owner and a use value for their non-owners. So remember, a use value only becomes a commodity when it enters into exchange. All right, like for example, if I make myself dinner like I did tonight, that is not a commodity. But it is a use value. It has use to me because I ate it, but I was not interested in exchanging it with anybody for anything else. So as soon as I am the owner of a commodity, I'm basically automatically declaring it non-useful to me. Like, I don't want this, but I do want something else. In other words, the non-owners, to everyone else, it is a use value. And use this, consequently, they must all change hands. And the change of hands is what constitutes exchange. The latter puts them in relation with each other as values, but realizes them as values. And hence, commodities must be realized as values before they can be realized as use values. So remember, they have to go through this comparison process in an exchange in order to be successfully purchased, if you will, and then only after being acquired in an exchange can you actually use it. And then he also says, this is sort of the flip side, right, where he says, on the other hand, they must show that they are use values before they can be realized as values. So again, you wouldn't be able to actually exchange them if they weren't useful. So they actually have to be useful before being exchanged. Let's see, what else? This is pretty straightforward. Let's see.
He does go on to say from there that only the active exchange can prove whether or not the labor is useful, or which is to say the commodity is useful. So it's just kind of one of those things like, it's a value, but it can't be a value unless it's a use value, but it can't be a use value unless you try to exchange it, but to exchange it, it has to be a value.
Yeah.
It's like there's like this weird circular logic in the whole thing, and I guess what he's saying is, well, jump in somewhere, I guess.
He'll get into a little bit of poking at that later when he goes into his lovely rant about mud pies. About useful value creation and value creation that has no use. See, the creation of busy work jobs that don't actually do anything meaningful, but it makes you look like you're functionally doing something.
So, middle management.
I was thinking more
Literally
desk jockey,
predicted
but very
modern
bad.
office culture.
Predicted what?
Literally predicted modern office culture.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, this little paragraph here is another good one. So he says, so remember, keep this circular looping process of exchange in mind. He says, money is a crystal formed of necessity in the course of the exchanges. Again, I'll just, for comparison, right, the Penguin version I think makes much more sense here. He says money necessarily crystallizes out of the process of exchange. definitely a slightly different meaning there, right?
Yeah.
It does. I mean, it's a crystal formed of necessity. It's like, come on, Angles. It's a little wordy for just saying crystallizes. I don't know if that was a word back then, but money necessarily crystallizes out of the process of exchange. Okay, let's see what he means by that. Whereby different products of labor are practically equated to one another, and thus by practice converted into commodities. The historical progress and extension of exchanges develops the contrast latent in commodities between use value and value. So, right, clearly there is a contrast, we could call it a contradiction, right, between use value and value. Just like I was saying earlier with the big old honkin' diagram, well, the first diagram, the Minecraft one, where you can't realize the use value of something if you choose to exchange it, and you can't exchange something if you choose to use it. That's at least one aspect of the contradiction. Obviously, there's lots of other ones, but that is one of the primary problems. And he says the necessity for giving an external expression to this contrast for the purposes of commercial intercourse urges on the establishment of an independent form of value. It finds no rest until it is once and for all satisfied by the differentiation of commodities into commodities and money. And at the same rate, then, as the conversion of products into commodities is being accomplished, so also is the conversion of one special commodity into money. So, I want to pause right there because I want to actually, I hope I bookmarked this correctly. I did not, but I will find it. Okay,
Which one are we? Okay, you found. Because I do have my Penguin copy sitting on my freaking desk.
No, this is actually not from the Penguin copy. This is actually from 17 Contradictions by David Harvey as well.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, David Harvey's good people.
Yeah, so, I mean, think of this book I have as basically just like the written version of his Capital
The
Lectures.
Anti-Capitalist Chronicles.
Well, that is a different book, I think. But
no, that's his ongoing live lectures.
oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a whole series on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
That's Democracy at Work puts that out, right?
Yeah. Wolf's channel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say that sounded like something Dr. Wolf put out.
Mm-hmm. It'd be.
Alright, hang on. I actually might be able to... Yeah, here's the PDF. Alright, let me get to this page. Nope, too much. Wait, I thought this was right. Oh, one more page. Okay, yeah. Zoom in. Okay. So this is on the chapter, The Social Value of Labor and Its Representation by Money. So I will probably reference this chapter again when we get to chapter 3, because yeah, chapter 3 is going to be a bear. But I think this is a nice little compliment to what I just read. So he says, money, we can say at the outset, is inseparable, but also distinct from the social labor that constitutes value. Money hides the immateriality of social labor, aka value, behind its material form. Right? Because money is, even though social labor is immaterial, right? You know, this is, I think this is Harvey's way of basically saying, like, abstract human labor. That is socially necessary. That whole thing, like abstract labor, is immaterial, right? Because we're performing an abstraction. Money is the material thing that links that makes the abstract physical, gives it material form. Okay, he says, it is all too easy to mistake the representation for the reality it seeks to represent. And to the degree that the representation falsifies, as to some degree it always does, we end up believing in and acting upon something that is false. In the same way we cannot see the social labor in any commodity, so we are particularly blinded to the nature of social labor by the money that represents it. We will look at examples shortly. The inseparability of value from its representation is important. It derives from the simple fact that without money and the commodity transaction it facilitates, value could not exist as an immaterial social relation. In other words, value could not form without the aid of the material representation, money, and the social practices of exchange. The relation between money and value is dialectical and co-evolutionary. They both emerge together rather than causal. And darn it if that's not pretty much exactly what Marx was just saying in this paragraph. So, right, when he says at the same... Sorry, I'll flip back to here. At the same rate, then, as the conversion of products into commodities is being accomplished, so also is the conversion of one special commodity into money. David Harvey is putting it one way, where he says the relation between money and value is dialectical and co-evolutionary. Marx is just saying it slightly differently, where he says, as things are becoming commodified, we also must develop money. There you go. Because, I mean, remember, commodities are just useful values, or use values that are values when they are brought into exchange. So anyways, yeah, they're basically saying the same thing there, or I should say Harvey's sort of referencing what Marx is saying. But yeah, I mean, I think this idea of this social practice of exchange bringing both money and value into existence simultaneously is, I think, a pretty interesting interpretation. It sort of answers the I mean, at least I think in one of the David Harvey lectures, I think where he talks about, you know, is Marx making a historical argument here, or is he making a logical argument? And in some ways I think Harvey's answer is sort of both. I think Marx is suggesting that instead of one evolving into the other, right, we shouldn't really think of it that way. He's calling them
Treating it as a
co-evolutionary. They come into existence at this simultaneously because they sort of
have to.
They have to. Yeah, money, like money being the material representation of value, is the only way humans could possibly make sense of it.
As I mentioned earlier, it's basically creating a universal trade value that itself has no actual use.
Or another way
outside
of
putting it
is that or another way of saying it is that money is a commodity whose only use is exchange.
Yeah.
And actually, Marx directly says that in like the next paragraph. He's like,
true, I think he does.
Yeah, the first way in which an object of utility attains the possibility of becoming an exchange value is to exist as a non-use value, as a quantum of use value superfluous to the immediate needs of its owner. Things are in themselves external to man and therefore alienable.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically what he's saying is, you know, again, kind of getting back to that, you really could pick anything as your universal medium of exchange. It's all ridiculous. But the fact of the matter is that there's always going to be something that has exchange value, that there's always going to be something that exists there as a non-use value, and ultimately we're going to, in local, in local minima and local maxima start to agree on things, and that's money.
Yeah, and so this paragraph is also, I think, again, it's another way of how Marx is describing the iterative feedback loop process. So he says the exchange of commodities therefore first begins on the boundaries of such communities at their points of contact with similar communities. Well, okay, that's all well and good, but basically he's saying like, okay, we start exchanging commodities when we meet somebody else who has stuff that we don't have, and we have stuff that they don't have. Okay, great. And then let's start here, right? So the proportions in which they're exchangeable are at first quite a matter of chance, right? So if these two communities, could be two individuals, but he's using communities, let's just use communities, they're meeting each other for the first time. They, I think he's the Inca. I don't know if he's why he's referencing the Inca, but yeah, let's just say we have two tribes that come across each other. They meet for the first time, and each tribe has a bunch of different cool things that the other tribe doesn't have. Okay, great. They're gonna want to make, and he says, let's say they have the mutual desire that their owners would like to alienate their products. In other words, I don't need this. We have loads of shells, but we don't have any llama fur or whatever. So, at first, right, the proportions in which you exchange them for at first are just kind of random. You're kind of like, I don't know. I mean, is llama fur super valuable? I don't know. I think these shells are pretty valuable. Basically, nobody has like a good starting point for exchanging things. He calls it chance. That's basically just saying it's random, right? And then he says, in the meantime, the need for foreign objects of utility gradually establishes themselves. So once we start exchanging things randomly, we start realizing why they're useful, and we start getting a little bit of a better idea. And then he says the constant repetition of exchange makes it a normal social act, and in the course of time, therefore, some portion of at least of the products of labor must be produced with a special view to exchange. And he says, from that moment, the distinction becomes firmly established between the utility of an object for the purpose of consumption and its utility for the purposes of exchange. So, again, I just wanted to keep mentioning when he says like the constant repetition, right? To me, that is indicative of this constantly going through the loop of exchange, or just boom, exchange. You're honing in on the value of things, and when you start honing in on the value of things, you're going to find that, oh, you know what? Some of these products of labor, are exchanged for a lot, right? With a special view to exchange. Basically, it's basically saying, oh man, this thing is a hot commodity, right? Pun intended, I suppose. But like, this thing can fetch a pretty fat price because it's clearly quite useful. And he's saying that at this moment, when you start realizing that, hey, this thing isn't just useful to me, it's also useful to other people, and in fact, it might be more useful to other people than it is to me. Maybe I should just produce these in order to exchange them for other cool stuff. And so, like, he says, use value becomes distinguished from its exchange value, right? People begin to become conscious of the difference between use value and exchange value once they realize, man, I could fetch, like, this thing could get a lot of money, or I don't know, be exchanged for a lot of stuff. Anyways, yeah, so let's see. That's an interesting little paragraph there, about how people basically become conscious of that, of the difference between use value and exchange value. Let's see, what else? I guess we could skip ahead slightly to more money stuff. Because I kind of wanted to get to the... Because we were just talking about, like, the use value of money.
Well, I mean, he basically goes from that, talking about, like, these individual, like, kind of isolated exchanges between, say, two communities, and that essentially as those exchanges stop being so local, either within a community or within a small group of communities, he says that in the same proportion as exchange bursts its local bonds, and the value of commodities accordingly expands more and more into the material embodiment of human labor as such, in that proportion does the money form become transferred to commodities which are by nature fitted to perform the social function of a universal equivalent, and those commodities are the precious metals. So basically what he's saying is like, okay, so you got 2 or 3 communities and each one produces something that the other one doesn't. You can just kind of evenly exchange maybe like a handful of things, kind of like our Minecraft server example where you've only got a few commodities. But once that kind of exchange becomes less local and more global, so to speak, maybe you start trading with another Minecraft server that has things that you don't have, and another Minecraft server that has more things yet.
New biomes
you don't
unlocked.
You can't then. It becomes too complicated and too physically cumbersome to try to figure out. Okay, so this thing that I have, what is that worth in literally 500 other things, or an infinite number of other things. All right, let's just simplify the process and just say everything is worth some amount of this one thing. It's like, let's just all agree on this.
Yep, let's just all agree that none of us have a ton of gold, but gold is very pretty and doesn't decay over time like food or goats. So yeah, right after that, alright, he finishes by saying gold and silver possess these properties by nature. Okay, so this is another spot where he uses reflex in this PDF, but in the book, well, actually, let me start a little bit ahead. So he says the use value of the money commodity becomes twofold. Twofold. Hold on a second. What does that sound? Hold on. Let me open the other.
The money commodity acquires a dual use value.
Dual forms. Yes, this sounds familiar. So.
Oh, look, dialectics.
That's right. Again, when you find things like this, even if it doesn't make sense at first, maybe try and reread these parts a couple times until you're like, okay. Because I'd be remiss if I didn't say there are definitely some paragraphs you can skim and be like, okay, yeah, maybe these were just case studies or Mark's just dunking on people for no reason. Well, I'm sure there's some reason, but he's just dunking on people for the fun of it. And then there's other portions where it's like, nope, this is actually pretty important, and maybe it's time to focus. So anyways, it's twofold, right? The use value of the money commodity. He says, in addition to its special use value as a commodity, and he says, oh, well, you can use gold to get fillings for your teeth, right? Or you can just make luxury goods out of it or something. It acquires a formal use value originating in its specific social function. And since all commodities are merely particular equivalents of money, the latter being their universal equivalent, they, with regard to the latter of the universal commodity, play the parts of particular. And we have seen that the money form is but the reflex, or in the other version says reflection, So this time it doesn't use mirror, but he says, we've seen that the money form is merely a reflection thrown upon a single commodity by the relations between all other commodities. Basically the same thing Engel's saying, roughly. He says, we've seen that money form is but the reflex thrown upon one single commodity of the value relations between all the rest. And that money is a commodity, is therefore a new discovery only for those who, when they analyze it, start from its fully developed shape. So again, money sort of co-evolves with value as a social relation, which means primitive forms of money weren't fully developed. They might have been a little more wishy-washy, and therefore it would have been difficult for previous people studying this to identify that money is actually just a commodity that ultimately just kind of obeys the same rules as commodity exchange as any other commodity. And let's see. The fact that money can... Oh, yeah. This is, I guess, this is where Marx is talking about, I think, like, coinage and paper money as well. Where he says, the fact that money can, in certain functions, be replaced by mere symbols of itself gave rise to that other mistaken notion that it itself is a mere symbol. Nevertheless, under this error lurked a presentiment that the money form of an object is not an inseparable part of the object, but is simply the form under which certain social relations manifest themselves.
Pre-sentiment, maybe?
The
Penguin
Penguin translation says that it contains the suspicion, which I like better. It's like,
Good call. Yeah.
Yeah. But that he continues as he goes, in this sense, every commodity is a symbol, since as a value, it is only the material shell of the human labor expended on it. And so at that point, you're like, okay, so it's essentially, at this point, symbolic economies all the way down, basically going backwards along the chain. Money, commodity, labor time.
Yeah. But I was going to mention, though, that this part was a little tricky to wrestle with, because I'm trying to question, okay, if we brought Marx into the voice call and we're like, dude, there's this new thing called fiat currency, which kind of is just a fucking symbol that the government controls, and they can change the value of it at any given...
economies all the way down.
Yeah, I'm like... Because he calls that an error in terms of... I think he means, an error of analysis, right? That, if you just think that money just is, I don't know. It's weird. Again, I need to read more about fiat currency.
I think Dave Harvey has something where he goes on a long-ass rant about the transition to fiat currency. Oh, God, where did I see that? I don't remember. It exists, I promise.
Yeah. Having that I will say, having that under our belt before Chapter 3 will probably be helpful.
Yeah. I'll have to see if I can find that. I think what it is, I don't think here he's necessarily talking about money being, I think it's more that some people are... Oh, okay, I think one sentence earlier, he goes, confusion between the two attributes, which is, I guess, the commodity form and the value, or the value and the use form. In confusion between the two attributes has misled some writers into maintaining that the value of gold and silver is imaginary. So I think what he's saying is it's an error to say that the value of these, specific material commodities that we have decided are money imaginary. I don't necessarily think that he'd have a problem with saying that fiat currency is imaginary.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point, right? Because, like, of course, gold and silver take a lot of effort to get out of the ground.
Yeah.
Which is why very, very little gold is very valuable. And I think that's, I mean, yeah, it certainly seems like he's saying, yeah, if you don't think the gold and silver has intrinsic, like, not intrinsic, but it has value as a normal ass commodity, right? You could buy gold and then, like, make earrings out of it or something. Then, like, yeah, it's not imaginary. It is actually real value. But then, yeah, it's like, well, then how would you address? And because I think what he's also saying is that, yeah, you can, and then you can go up one level more and say, hey, you know what, this piece of paper represents, an ounce of gold.
Right.
So he's basically saying, yeah, you can replace it with symbols, but that doesn't mean
But
it
it's
itself is a
still
symbol. So
right,
I guess
it's
he's
still
saying,
a
like, it's a
storage of
symbol.
labor it's still a storage of labor time.
Yeah, and so that's the lingering question for me is like, okay, well then, is fiat currency just like a conscious effort to basically say, you know what, this money no longer has a material basis?
Right, and I guess because okay, so when the dollar, for example, was backed by gold, you can go and you can exchange it for gold, and gold has a storage of labor time because it took time to get that gold out, and so
Yep.
on and so forth. You can essentially trace the economy back to its base unit of labor time. So I guess the question is with fiat currency, because you can't trace that back to any physical commodity, could you still say, well, okay, we're just cutting out the middleman, so to speak, and fiat currency itself now is essentially a symbol for the intangible unit labor time? Like that, I guess maybe is like the philosophical question to ask there. But at which point, then we're still, in theory, I guess, just making up values.
I mean, it's either that or, and this is where when I'm saying, like, I need to research how the fuck, like, what did they actually do when they switched off the gold standard? Because I imagine when they did it, the dollar yesterday should be worth the same as a dollar tomorrow.
And it is not
well,
really. It is and it isn't.
I'm saying, like, if we agreed, like, let's say that we run the Fed and we're like, you know what, fuck the gold standard. The commies are mining too efficiently. In order for the economy not to collapse, like, immediately, you know what I mean? Like, they would have to make the announcement, hey, we're not on the gold standard anymore, but also make sure that the dollar is still worth the same. So is it more like, I don't know what year they switched, but I don't know, I'm just going to throw out a number, like 1970. Let's just say, like, okay, starting in 1970, $1 is worth as much as $1 was in 1969. And then from there, it can still fluctuate based on how many dollars are in circulation. Just like, so basically, like, maybe that's not how it works. No, that can't be how it works. Because the whole point of abandoning the gold standard is that you're like, the total possible value is basically unlimited. Right, because basically, if you're married to a gold standard, that means, like, all the money, every single U.S. dollar combined is worth as much as all the gold in the U.S. If I'm not misunderstanding that.
I think to add,
Yeah, roughly, because I think the whole idea is that they had to have enough gold on hand to where if you wanted to come and take your or I should say gold and silver, because there were some that were silver certificates
True.
rather than gold. But they had to have enough of these precious metals on hand that if you wanted to go in and everybody just decided, hey, all of my cash, which is either a gold certificate or a silver certificate, I want to turn that back into the commodity, they had to be able to do that.
Right.
And so that
might
was,
mean the gold
in
is,
theory,
finite.
a hedge against inflation. And so I guess what it was is, it's not that they necessarily didn't have that on hand. It was more that if they basically couldn't print more money if they needed to create, because most of the control of the world's gold at the time was in the hands of people that they considered adversaries.
Right.
Because if you print more money, you have to get more gold, and you can't get more gold if the people who have the extra gold aren't your friends. They might hold on to that and not be willing to give it to you for a good price or a fair price, because they want to tank your economy. Or at least so the paranoia would go. I'm kind of having this conversation with you, sort of loosely looking for the thing about David Harvey talking about fiat currency, but I cannot find it right now. I'll look for it afterward.
I think I'm just gonna have to think about it a little more. Maybe reading the next chapter will give hints.
Because it's like, was the idea of a fiat currency even a thing at the time? Like one of those things that maybe people batted around as a thought experiment that then everybody just agreed, oh God, let's never do that.
I mean, we actually talked about this in the European meeting a little bit. And I think one of them mentioned that like one of the earliest fiat currencies was like in the 1600s. Was it the Netherlands or something? But basically, like they were just like the broke boys of Europe. Like they didn't have very much gold or something like that. So they're like, shit, we should just come up with some arbitrary money and like.
Maybe they were the ones who were just like, oh, this value of gold and silver is just made up anyway, so let's just make up our own money.
They didn't throw any particular sources, and I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But basically they're pointing out that like there were other reasons for especially smaller economies to get off the gold standard. Mostly because I think the main reason is they just didn't have very much gold.
And it's very difficult to run a war when you're trying to attach it to currency that you don't actually have.
Yeah. Plus, I can't imagine, like, modern national debt that's tied to gold. Like,
that would be really fun to try to explain and get past the but money isn't real part.
Yep.
Wouldn't China just have all the gold then?
Pretty much, yeah.
You'd think.
I mean, it's not like they don't have enough of it.
Mm-hmm.
Alright, let's see where to jump back in here. Oh, I think I'm already at the end, actually. You know what? Let's just go over the last paragraph, as is the usual.
Yeah. That's about the last thing that I have highlighted.
Yeah, I was going to say, we were pretty much at the end anyway, so we'll just hit the conclusion. Alright. We have already seen from the most elementary expression of value that X commodity A equals Y commodity B, and that the object in which the magnitude of the value of another object is represented appears to have the equivalent form independently of this relation as a social property given to it by nature. Again, there's that word appears, so this statement's probably not true. We followed up this, there it is, false appearance to its final establishment which is complete so soon as the universal equivalent form becomes identified with the bodily form of a particular commodity, and thus crystallized into the money form. See, Angles, you know what the word crystallized was, you goofball. Okay, yeah, so...
Gosh, was hard.
You're right. Again, just...
He wanted to flex his knowledge of the English language on all them pores.
I guess so. Either that or Marx must have used 2 different German words with the word crystal in it or something. I don't know. Anyways, he says, what appears to happen is not that gold becomes money in consequence of all other commodities expressing their values in it, but on the contrary, that all other commodities universally express their values in gold because it is money. So, again, sort of interpret, the way I'm interpreting this at least, again, it has to do with it's like he says, gold doesn't become money in sort of this, like, don't think of it as like stages of evolution. It's co-evolutionary. Right? Money develops because values develop, or not because, but alongside values. Yeah. It's like symbiosis, sort of, to use like the biology analogy. Right, if 2 organisms need each other to survive, there's a good chance they're going to co-evolve with one another.
It's like there are certain species of like flower that are pollinated by a specific species of like hummingbird.
Yep.
Kind of, if you're looking for like a coevolution example.
Alternatively, I've heard of small frogs being kept as pets by tarantulas.
Yep, they eat wasps. That's what they do.
They protect the eggs, and then the tarantulas are basically big bodyguards for them.
Though I would use the analogy of more of religious institution evolution here. Because primarily it's still faith-based in the end.
Yeah. Yeah, it is, exactly. I guess we can't really cling to the biological evolution as an analogy like too fiercely. It is still a social relation at the end of the day. Anyways, let's see. The immediate steps of the process vanish in the result and leave no trace behind. Commodities and their own value already completely represented without any initiative on their part in another commodity existing in company with them. So again, the commodities are finding their own value without any initiative on their part. Like, the commodities aren't the ones doing this. It's the people. But they're also not finding... It's not like you can pick apart a commodity and find, oh, this is the value, like I found it. No, they have to do... They can only determine that value by coming into contact with other commodities. And these objects, gold and silver, just as they come out of the bowels of the earth, are forthwith the direct incarnation of all human labor. Hence the magic of money. In the form of society now under consideration, the behavior of men in the social process of production is purely atomic. Or I think in the other version it says atomized, I think. Hence,
Atomistic. Which I like atomic better, actually. Like, atomistic, what is that?
Yeah, I like atomatized because it... I mean, to me, that just means, like...
Broken down into very small pieces.
Right, everyone's... an individual, right? It's like what fucking Margaret Thatcher said, right?
Atomized is also fucking metal because it invokes images of something being absolutely fucking disintegrated.
True.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
Atomic. Marx predicted the atom bomb. True. Hence, their relations to each other in production assume a material character independent of their control and conscious individual action. These facts manifest themselves at first by products as a general rule taking the form of commodities. We have seen how the progressive development of a society of commodity producers stamps one privileged community with the character of money. Privileged commodity with the character of money. Hence, the riddle presented by money is nothing but the riddle presented by commodities. Only now it strikes us in its most glaring form. And that's the lead into what the fuck is money, dude? And more circulation of commodities questions. Okay. Now, are there any questions? I'm sure we covered everything.
I think I'm good here. This is definitely a fun little poking at some of the background thought process.
Yeah.
Yep. I personally went through these two sections way fucking faster than the first 3 parts of chapter 1. So
Yeah.
Because chapter 1 is such a slog. It's like once you get in.
Chapter 1's mostly that frickin' proof.
Yeah. Although chapter 3 is still pretty dense. So I feel like that's going to be like chapter 1 turning my brain to mashed potatoes again.
Yeah, no, chapter 3 is going to do it again, and then once we get into chapter 4, that's where you really hit the ground running.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. It's starting to feel like, you know, when your friend tells you, oh, you're this series, but you just kind of have to bear with like the whole first season and it gets better.
Yep.
What was this? The Last of Us, you say?
Oh yeah, episode 2 just came out. I need to watch that.
Kind of like, at least every time that I've read Gatsby, it just seems to take forever until chapter 6, and then I'm done. I'm like, oh, okay, there went the rest of the novel.
Yeah, and then the last one on the frickin' egg, and you're like,
Yep.
really? Why?
No.
Yeah.
I'll pass. It's just that book is just Gilded Age navel gazing anyway.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. I just remembered that we watched the first episode of The Last of Us in stream. Are we gonna watch the second one? It's out now.
I'm down.
Yeah.
I ended up having to dip
We
out
gotta end
before
this,
before
obviously.
we.
But yes.
I was gonna say,
Yeah, no,
I ended up having
let's-
to dip out.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if we were done here.